All right, this is Jason with Eastern Star Small Engine, Old School Mechanic. We're working on a Craftsman chainsaw. This is made by Poulan. Problem what we're having is broken fuel lines. Okay, these fuel lines, they'll deteriorate with the ethanol. So see, that doesn't even bend anymore. I don't know if I can get it to break or not, but it's to the point where that's not going to do any good. The fuel line going inside of the tank, which is this hole right here, which is your smaller line, is broke inside the tank. The customer said it couldn't get it to start. Well, it's not getting any fuel. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace all these fuel lines. You got to keep in mind there's a primer bulb right down here that will run the fuel back to the tank. Okay, so the way I do this is I'll take this fuel line and I'll cut it in a V shape so I can at least get it down in that hole so I can get a hold of it with a pair of needle nose pliers, and we'll restring that. Now this is the main fuel line. This is what your fuel filter is going to hook up to. And it looked like the fuel filter wasn't in the tank because the customer probably opened the tank up and it fell out, and they didn't bring it in with them. So I sliced that back so where I can get it in there. So I start pushing it through. I'm going to turn the saw over on its side, and you can reach your finger in there and you can start to feel this. Now this can be pretty challenging too, because you try to reach in there and you can't see what you're reaching for, so you just kind of have to fish your way around and try to find it. Sometimes you find it right away, sometimes it takes a bit. So you just kind of judge it. Now I use these bent needle nose pliers. They work really well for this. Like I say, it can be a challenge. Right there it is. Pull this up through. Okay, now I'm going to cut this off. I'm going to put my fuel filter back on. And one thing you want to remember when you're putting this back on is this fuel filter has to lay flat in the tank. The fuel filters are weighted, so however you tip the chainsaw, that fuel filter is going to follow the fuel. Okay, don't put the fuel line on the fuel filter and let it just dangle. You can't do that. You've got to make sure it's laying flat on the bottom of the tank, or you will run out of fuel. So now we're gonna move on to this other hole back here, and that's the return line coming from the primer bulb. Okay, you always pull fuel through the carburetor. You don't push it. You can get these fuel lines backwards, and these things, they might start, but they won't stay running. Now I'm not for sure if this carburetor is going to be any good or not, but we're going to check this out. We're going to put the fuel lines in first and see what this does. And we'll be back here in just a minute. Okay, we got our fuel filter on here. Now the way I had that cut, I had it cut at an angle so I get it back through the top and into the tank. I cut that back off flat, put my fuel filter on. Okay, now I got it stretched out here. It's easier to work with. But what I do is I go ahead and grab this fuel line and start bringing it back through. Okay, then I simulate how this is going to work. So I'll put it back in the tank. Okay, and if you look inside of that tank, and I'll put a flashlight on it where you can see. Okay, it looks like I'm just a little bit, I need to pull it down just a little bit. A little bit more. Okay, you can see how it's laying flat in there. It's laying good and flat. So that's the way you want it. Okay, and that fuel filter will actually acts like a sponge. Okay, so I'm gonna get this to length and cut this off. This is your return line. You do it the same way. You cut it at an angle, put it through there far enough where you can get a hold of it with a pair of needle nose. This return line comes back across and goes to the primer bulb. Now the primer bulbs, they have one that's longer than the other. Okay, the longer one is the return to the tank. This one right here pulls fuel through the carburetor. The longer one, pushes it back to the tank. Pull fuel through the carburetor. Don't push it. You'll make the carburetor flood. So if you're priming it and you've got fuel running out of the carburetor, you've got your fuel lines backwards. Okay, so we're going to get this fuel line cut to length and put it back in our primer bulb right here. Okay, and then the other line is going to come up to the side of the carburetor right here, and then we'll hook the rest of this up and we'll see if this will run. Okay, we got our fuel lines put on. Something I want to show you, this fuel line right here. Okay, you got to make sure it comes off the shorter piece on the primer bulb, goes up to this side of the carburetor. Make sure you don't kink this line. I've got the other line coming up that we push through the tank that hangs onto the fuel filter, up and through, and hooks to this side of the carburetor. The fuel line I use, now these are Poulan numbers here. This is the bigger line that I use, and this stuff works really good against ethanol. And here's the other part number I use. And this is the small stuff here. That's the bigger stuff. Works really well against this ethanol. This ethanol will shrink these fuel lines. They collapse, they break. So this fuel line works really well. We're gonna put the choke back on. I've got to put this piece back on. This is where you put your tools through to adjust your carburetor. We're gonna see if this carburetor will respond, and we will go from there. Okay, we got all of our fuel lines put on. Now I want to show you how the fuel is moving, the flow of it. Now the hose that we have the camera on, that's the line going back to the tank from the primer bulb. And here's a good way to make sure that you have it plumbed right. Now I'm going to push the primer bulb and you can see the fuel actually moving back into the tank. That's the way it's supposed to be. So the fuel line going back into the tank goes to the longer barb on the primer bulb. I'm going to put this cover back on and make sure that this will run. These carburetors, you never know what they're going to do, and this is the bad part about it. You put fuel lines on it, you go to start it and it won't run right, or the motor will float, or it'll hunt trying to find itself, and then we end up having to put a new carburetor on it. For the price of these carburetors, it's really not worth rebuilding them. You put you a new one on it. I think they're about $35, $40, and they run exactly like you need them to. Okay, so here we go. We're gonna start this thing up, see how it works. That sounds pretty good. We will call the customer and tell him he's ready to go. Please like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.